Good morning, everybody. Dr. David Cartland here. I'm just speaking to you to introduce a meeting that we presented to a few members of the drcartland.com subscribers group, and was sponsored by the brilliant organisation that is the People's Health Alliance. And it was on the subject of chemtrails, which, as I know from conversations that I've had, is a very divisive area, even within the awake community, for want of a better phrase. But we were lucky to have somebody who had worked within the industry willing to discuss this in a bit more detail with us and to go into a few more the nitty-gritty of the subject, really, as to what's happening above our heads in the sky and who's perpetrating it. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest. Just to warn you, we've instituted some voice-changing technology, and we've covered this wonderful pilot's face for his own protection, as I'm sure you'll understand why. Just to tell you a little bit about his CV briefly and anonymously, he has been a pilot now for 33 years, with a very varied career, has flown every kind of airliner and been there and done it all. So we're very privileged to introduce to you this particular captain. I will hand you over to him now. Enjoy.
Very much. Well, thank you for that, David, and good evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here as one commensurate professional to so many others, and it's just really nice to be able to share this with you, because there's a lot of disinformation over chemtrails, contrails, and that is obviously by design, and it's also, it's what you know. Yeah, so as we go on here, just because this is my first time that I've actually done anything like this, all I would respectfully say is that there may be things that I say that resonate with you, and anything I do say, because this is inextricably linked with just about everything else that is going on, believe it or not. So at no time be offended that I'm teaching anybody to suck eggs. It's just that I'm sharing information, and I don't obviously know what information you do or don't know. But this is a subject that's obviously very, very close to my heart. And I have to be honest, I did fall into the trap many years ago. I was on a flight, and my first officer said to me, have you seen the chemtrails? And I said, oh, don't be ridiculous, there aren't any chemtrails. And he said, yeah, there is. And I never broached it with him again, but I've always remembered that very short conversation. And then it was very shortly after we went into, I think it was just before the first lockdown. I live in Cheshire, and there's a lot of hills around here. And I was coming out of a cafe, and I literally was staggered. I had my jaw open, because there was a line which went north-south, which was about 10 miles long, because I could see the points over the ground. But it was the 13 very short ones that went across it. And I thought, hang on a minute. Then I actually saw an aeroplane contrailing at about 37,000 feet. And I deduced that this was around about 2/3 of the way down, or about 1/3 of the way up from the ground. So I deduced that that was at around about 10 to 12,000 feet. I hadn't got my phone with me. I got home, and I rang a friend of mine who works at Manchester Airport, and I said, are you in your office? Is there an aeroplane doing squiggly lines over Manchester at the moment at around 10,000 feet? And his answer was no. But there is one at 12,000 feet. And I said, well, do you have his registration? Yes, I do. He's now heading off towards Cardiff. He went round Cardiff, Swansea, and then headed off towards the Irish Sea at 12,000 feet. And so, of course, that registration gave me an in. So I looked up who it was, and it's a company called 2XL Aviation, and it's a 727. Now, 727 is a very old Boeing. It's a 3-engine jet. FedEx were flying them for about 35, 40 years, and for freighters, that's what they were. Originally passenger aircraft a long, long time ago. And I thought, what on earth are they doing? So that took me down on a very long journey, down a deep rabbit hole. But they do exist. And obviously, with what we're going through at the moment, a lot of people tend to just ignore them, although they're over their head, which I do find slightly annoying. So I'm not quite sure where to start with this, but the history of chemtrailing, it's nothing new. We just didn't realise it was going on. Probably the country where it originally started was the United States of America, and the military have been involved in all sorts of programs with chemtrailing and cloud seeding and all sorts of things for probably around about 45, 50 years. So it's nothing new. We just didn't realise it was going on. In the UK, as far as my research has led me to believe, is that the British government started this not long after World War II. And as a result of the information that tends to get released after in the Public Records Office after 30 years, other people have done quite a bit of research, and there are all sorts of programs that have gone on that the government at the time denied when people have fallen sick and doctors are scratching their heads going, why have we got this outbreak, can't work it out. One of the famous ones that the government were doing, there was a railway tunnel down in Dorset. I can't remember which one it was now, but they were actually spraying chemicals onto a passing train, which of course would then go into the tunnel and it would fill all up. And they were doing that for quite some time. And again, at the time, they denied they were doing it. So it's sort of come from there, really. It's nothing new. Where this has come from, the current modern day stuff that's going on is from if you trace it all back, it goes to the Paris Climate Accord. But prior to that, the Americans, as I say, were well up with this, as were the Canadians as well. They were doing it as well. And this does go back to cabal, Illuminati. It all goes back to the money, who's funding it, why they're funding it, and so on. So that's where one of the big links is. And I believe me, I've researched this time and time again, and it all goes back to the same money sources and the same agenda. And the agenda is very dark. This is overall a battle for souls, and you know they'll try and get us any way they can by lying, cheating, and stealing, and whatever they can come up with. Some of these, not some of them, most of the concepts behind the excuses that they give for justifying what they're doing is nothing short of very clever, very persuasive, and almost ingenious, but it's not for good, it's for bad. So the chemtrails themselves, what I'd probably start to do is give you some physiology so you can understand the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail. So a contrail is something that you would see an aeroplane at high level, and there's white coming out the back, and it tends to disappear, it tends to evaporate, maybe goes into squiggly lines, and it can last for 10 seconds to maybe up to a minute or so. That's perfectly normal. Now, I'm not going to use the word fossil fuel because it's actually a mineral fuel. Fossil fuel was invented by the Rockefellers to try and give it an idea of scarcity so they could charge lots of money for it. Oil, I believe, is the second most renewable liquid on the planet next to water. Every 10 years, apparently, it renews. But anyway, from these oil fields. But we'll leave that to one side. So the physics of it is this. If you have a parcel of air, and it's when you've probably gone on holiday where it's been very humid, that means that the temperature of the air, whatever it is, that the dew point, which is probably close to saturation. So as a pilot, if I'm landing back into Manchester or Newquay or wherever at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the weather information says that the temperature is 4 degrees and the dew point is 3 and the wind is calm, my first thought is, well, if the temperature goes down 1 more degree to meet the dew point with calm wind, that could fog out. So because the air, the warmer the air, it can contain more moisture. The cooler the air, it can contain less moisture. So on average, if you go up 1,000 feet from sea level, the temperature reduces, whatever that temperature is, it tends to reduce by 2 degrees per 1,000 feet. Contrails, which is as a result of the burning of the mineral fuel, because it's like a paraffin, Jet A1 and Jet 1B is like is just like a paraffin, for want of a better description. But as a result of burning that, you do get water vapor. And we've all followed cars on a very damp morning in autumn where we're in a queue going to work. And, you know, we see steam coming out of people's exhausts. And that's exactly what it is. It is steam, because that's a byproduct of the burn of the mineral fuel. The water's already in it. And it's no different with an aeroplane. The only physics with an aeroplane engine is when it's flying at 37,000 feet, it's generally the temperature bottoms out at about minus 63 Celsius, minus 65 Celsius. Doesn't normally get any colder than that. And in a quicker time than it takes for me to click my fingers, it's being compressed 5 or 6 times in the engine. It gets burnt at 730 odd degrees. and then kicks out the back. Now, if that parcel of air just happens to be slightly damp, then that's when you see the white, which is just trillions of ice crystals, and they will evaporate. So that's a contrail. Now, the other thing that's very key here is that a contrail cannot form below -40. When I mean below -40, I mean if it's -39, -38, you won't get a contrail. And that equates to around about 28,000 feet, -40. And then when you go higher, it gets colder, and that's when you start seeing the contrails. And then the other common question is, well, hang on a minute. Why is it one day that I can see hundreds of aeroplanes flying over Cornwall or wherever we are, and then the next day I don't see any? Well, the answer is those aeroplanes are always there, because that part of the world, you tend to get a lot of the Atlantic tracks where aircraft are coming from the Caribbean, from the States, from Canada, and they all come across. And so that's roughly where they end up, somewhere on that lower west coast of the UK. If the parcel of air they're flying in is dry, then you won't see anything. And I used to have, on the 767 particularly, we had forward and rearward looking cameras underneath the fuselage. And literally you can be flying very smooth air, halfway across the Atlantic, minding your own business, and then all of a sudden there's a little bump. And it's like a little bit of air turbulence, but it's just a slight bump. And first thing I'll do is I'll look at the temperature, and I'll just notice that the temperature has gone colder by 1 degree. So that means that that parcel of air I'm now flying in is slightly more dense. So then I can look in the camera, and now I see that I'm actually leaving a contrail. And that may last for 100 miles, it may last for 10 miles. It just depends on the air at the time. So that's the contrail. The chemtrail is completely different. Now, there's two things that they're doing here. I'll address the main one that we can see, which is the one at around about 12,000 feet. These are chemicals. There's no two ways about it. Their purpose are twofold. One is to block out the sun, in accordance with the very fallacious and very fraudulent Paris Climate Accord. And the other one is the chemicals do rain down, and these are not just microparticles, some of them are nanoparticles. So the point is here is that it very slowly but insidiously poisons us. It poisons the water courses, the animals, us, the trees, the grass, everything. That's the idea. The main constituents are barium, strontium, aluminium oxide, and they can put, quite frankly, anything else in it that they choose. Now, I believe the aluminium oxide is a good one for kicking off Alzheimer's. I'm sure that some of us here are old enough to remember probably back in the 70s and 80s, we really didn't hear of Alzheimer's at all, but now it's it's being promoted by the media and everybody's got Alzheimer's. So anything aluminium, that's bad. The barium and strontium, I believe, they cause all sorts of cancers, and we know probably for other reasons as well that cancers are now dramatically on the increase. The next question that people who are critical thinkers tend to ask is why, which is a loaded question. One other thing I would like just to mention, Thomas Cook has 460 pilots. As I say, we are taught to be critical thinkers, particularly if something goes wrong and you're 1,200 miles from a landing airfield. You're taught to be critical thinkers. Out of those 460 people, there's only 6 of us who are awake. So we've had to walk away from the others, because if you try to engage them, you get ridicule, and I'm sure people on this call can identify that with probably fellow professionals and also family. So going back to the question of why and how. So when I started looking at this, because I managed to get hold of an aircraft registration, which, by the way, if you've got a pen and paper, please write it down. It's G, which is British, O, SRA, and SRB. And those are 2727s registered to a company called 2, as in the number 2, Excel Broadsword Aviation. And if you look into the actual name, it's actually quite a satanic name. Anyway, that aside, then you look into the company. And the company was started by 2 ex-RAF Harrier pilots. one of whom I think I know both of them. I think ended up being on the Queen's flight, and they enjoyed obviously flying royalty around and rubbing shoulders and so on. And they started this company, and their sole income is government contracts. Now, one of the two main directors, he saw the writing on the wall. He saw what the plans for them to do were, and bowed out. He obviously knew too much, so they threatened him. And this is how these people work. This chap was doing an air display in an old Boeing Stearman, which is a biplane, had a wing walker on top, and it was over, I think it's Brighton or somewhere on the south coast. And he was doing the display over the sea, as you do, and inexplicably he had an engine failure. And he managed to get the aeroplane, he ditched the aeroplane, the wing walker was hurt, but anyway, they both survived. And it was quite low level that it happened, so it was a lot of skill that it took for him to actually get the aeroplane down in the best way possible. It later transpires that the aeroplane was interfered with. And of course, and then it's a matter of proving who interfered with it. But that was a warning to him, is that you keep your mouth shut. And this is what these people do. Now, the other director, he's still there. So I did a lot of digging into the company. They were based in Doncaster, and Doncaster has since closed. They're now based at Teesside. And to operate this operation, any operation, to form an airline or a cargo airline or whatever it is, you have to produce a set of manuals. You have to produce a set of rules and regulations which have to comply with European regulations and also the UK regulations. You then make a very expensive application to the Civil Aviation Authority, and they either suggest some alterations, and then they give you something called an AOC, which is an Air Operator Certificate, which is your license to operate those airplanes in accordance with what it says in your manuals. Now, to excel, also, like any other airline, will get inspected at least once a year, more likely twice a year, by the Civil Aviation Authority. Now, because these aeroplanes they're flying were cargo aeroplanes, they lend themselves very easily to being converted into sprayers. And what's unique about these two aeroplanes is that there is a lateral boom, which I think is around about, we're just estimating is about 5.5, 6 meters long, which goes laterally across the back of the aeroplane underneath the engines. From that boom, which is a permanent fixture, there are 16 very large nozzles. And then inside the aeroplane, on the cargo deck, strapped down, there are 7 tanks. Collectively, they hold around about just under 4,000 gallons. Of what duration that gives them, I don't know. But obviously, this is specialist equipment. Now, I can tell you now that if somebody steals a sink plug from the forward toilet, we can't have an engineer going down to B&Q and going buying another one, because it's not approved for the aircraft. You've got to get an approved item, and it's got to be entered into the tech log. So everything is recorded. And the CAA would have had an application for these guys to put these tanks in the aeroplane. And also, they have 2 inspections each year, which are normally held at the same time. One will be an operations inspection to check that they are flying in accordance with their manuals and their rules and regulations, and they'll be looking at training and all sorts of things that they do for the pilots. And if there's anything the CAA is not happy about, you get either a violation or you get a recommendation, and you have to put it right within a certain period of time. The other one will be an engineering inspection to make sure that the technical log of the airplane is being kept up to date, that any parts that they've been using are genuine parts, and they can choose things randomly. So you think it's very strictly controlled. So the AOC, and this is what they hide behind, says that they are oil spill response. So the logic here is, on their website, it says that they are oil spill response for the UK. So the first question that came into my mind was, when was the last time we had an oil spill around the UK? A long time ago. And why do they need 2 aeroplanes? And then they say the answer to that is, well, we can go worldwide. And I thought, well, in the 727, if they've got a major spill in Australia, you'd take about 3 days to get there. It's because of its limited range. So anyway, that aside, I then looked at their AOC and they can spray over the water. And I thought, fantastic, they're spraying over the land. It's a massive violation. They have 2 AOCs, I then found out. One is that they can spray pesticides or approved materials over forested areas. Well, clearly they're not. Last time I looked in Manchester, there wasn't a forested area right over the city of Manchester or Birmingham or anywhere else. So anyway, this is, so that now the why they're doing it is because they're being directed to by the government. It's government contracts. So I then started to look and follow the money. That's always a good one because that will tell you who the source is. So the source is the British government. The British government under pressure are now saying, yes, it's all in accordance with the Paris Climate Accord. But then when you look at the data that the Paris Climate Accord and all of these other accords have actually based themselves on, it's all false. It's fraud. That's what it is. Now, I've got a bit of information about that, which I'll allude to later. So these airplanes it's not just 2XL Aviation. They've actually chartered a lot of other aircraft because I'm obviously networking with people up and down the country, and I've been down in Cornwall several times over the last 6 months. The last time was about a month ago. And I actually got with a telephoto lens, I got a Delta Airways Airbus A330, which is a big long-range aircraft. They're based in Atlanta, Georgia. That's their main base. They do fly into Heathrow. But he was at around 12,000 feet flying north over Falmouth. I did get a photo of the airplane and I positively identified. Now I'm thinking, well, what are these people, what, you know, so this is probably an old airplane that they had as a spare. They were probably going to scrap it or sell it. And then all of a sudden they picked up a contract and it's an easy conversion. You can unbolt the seats, you can put in the tanks, you put in the sprays, and there you go. Now, so there's a lot of people doing it. So we've got the military, and the UK military have been doing it. We've got 2XL Aviation, we've got various cargo operators, and then we've got Air Transat, because I've spotted one of those, and also Delta. And the other morning, at 4:30 in the morning, I also got 2 shots of other aircraft. Now, these aircraft are not on any of the flight tracker apps that you and I can get, none of them. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, the airplane has something called a transponder. It's mandatory, it has to be on. If it's broken, there's a spare. If that's broken, you have to get a dispensation before you can fly the airplane, and it probably won't be with passengers on. But what these apps also do, there's a large bank of transponder codes that these apps have blanked out, and it's just a bit of software. That's all that is. How are these aeroplanes flying at 10,000 feet and 12,000 feet? Who's allowing it? When they get airborne, there's 2 flight plans that they can file. Now, if I'm on a normal passenger jet and I'm getting airborne out of Newquay or Birmingham or wherever, and I'm going to Tenerife, regardless of whether it's a clear run all the way down there and I can see for hundreds of miles, because I'm flying in the Airways system, I have to file something called an IFR flight plan. It's Instrument Flight Rules. So it doesn't matter whether it's clear or whether I get airborne and 50 feet after my wheels leave the ground, I go straight into cloud and I don't see Tenerife until I actually pop out of the cloud at 200 feet at the other end. It doesn't matter. I can fly on the instruments in the airways, but the flight plan is saying exactly where I'm going to point to point to point to point. The other flight plan, and this is, and people just tend to think of tiny aircraft, 2- and 4-seater aircraft, but you can do this with any aeroplane, is called VFR, which is a visual flight plan, which means I can just say to the tower, I'm going visual, I've got 7 hours endurance, I'm going to the southwest. And providing I keep out of everybody's airspace or speak to the appropriate controllers en route, then I can do exactly that. Nothing stopping me doing it. Now, there's nothing stopping you doing it in a 2-seater Cessna, and there's nothing stopping you doing it in a 747. And they do that in the States, believe it or not. It's not widely practiced over here. Now, this is where they're being crafty. So initially, they were filing flight plans. IFR flight plans, but they don't anymore. So we can see them. And I'm thinking, well, who is controlling these? And I've actually got the direct number for Manchester Air Traffic Control, and I've had various conversations with the controllers who are there live in the tower. And they've actually told me, no, you're mistaken, they are contrails. And I said, you know darn well they're not. And he said, I can't say any more. And that's usually the end of the conversation. So they know it's going on, but Manchester are not controlling them. So if you look at a map of the airspace of the UK, on the really above about 10, 12,000 feet, it's divided into two halves. At a point between Manchester and Birmingham, north, that's called Scottish, and everything south is London. There are two ATC, or air traffic control units, that do Scottish and do London. One is civil, which is normally who we'd always speak to, and the other one is military. So you can talk to Scottish military or you can talk to Scottish civil. Now I've got a scanning radio. Now here's the thing. When you speak to air traffic control, it's on VHF, very high frequency. It's basically line of sight. UHF is the next band up, and that is really for the military. And I've just bought a UHF radio, actually. It arrived yesterday, so I'm going to tune that in and see what I can hear. But what's happening is this. This is by deduction. They get airborne out of Teesside or wherever they are. Prestwick, that's another one they use. And they talk to Scottish military, and Scottish military have actually gone and blocked off some airspace, probably between 10 and 12,000 feet, 200 miles wide, 400 miles deep, and then they can go on their patterns and they can fly their patterns. And they're all briefed. The other thing is, do the pilots know what they're actually doing? Because there's been a big contention that, well, they can't, it's just an automatic system on the airplane. Rubbish. And I'll tell you why that's rubbish. So particularly with the 727s. And that is because the captain, when he has anything that's classified as dangerous goods, and barium, strontium and aluminium oxide all mixed together, is classified as a dangerous good. It's in the IATA book of dangerous goods. They have to have something called a NOTOC, which is a notice to captain. It's a piece of paper that says exactly what he's got on board. And this is the reason why. So they have an emergency on the aeroplane, there's an engine fire or an engine failure or something, and he suddenly has to divert into Stansted. The fire chief has got absolutely no idea what that freighter has got on board. He doesn't know whether he's dealing with radioisotopes, forces, toxic chemicals that may have now leaked because it was a hard landing, whatever. So he has to know, so the captain has to sign for this NOTOC. So this is the way they're doing it. They're getting airborne, they're talking to Scottish control, the airplane is flying on autopilot, but in the autopilot there's already a prescribed tracks that they're flying backwards and forwards, and then they go somewhere to replenish when they've run out. And the one difficulty, I'll be honest, I've had is trying to find out where these people are landing. Now, what I've noticed over the last 3 years is that the chemical trails that they're leaving, the 727 is distinctive because it looks like a wide piece of tagliatelle in the sky. The others are a little bit more difficult because they've got smaller delivery systems that then gets mixed into the jet thrust that's coming out the back of the engine. And I suspect there's a pipe down the pylon that holds the engine on, and it comes right through that delivery system. And then, of course, there's so much air coming out the back of the engine, it's swirling around, it's very unstable. And of course, if you put anything into that stream, it will mix it up nicely. And some of it is manual, on off, other bits are automatic, delivery rate that can be predetermined. They can do patterns in the sky, they can switch it on, switch it off, switch it on, switch it off to try and make it look like a contrail. They've tried every trick in the book. The worrying item with all of this is, despite those three main ingredients, there's also been a contention that they've been putting graphene oxide in. That's nasty. That reacts with frequencies, electrical currents and all sorts, and that's nano. And of course, there's nothing stopping them putting really anything in it. There's a lot of aeroplanes doing it. The one frustration I've found is that I'm desperately trying to find out where these aeroplanes are landing in the UK. I've got my suspicions. So what I'm going to say, just as a general wide broadcast now to everybody, is to network as much as you can, because you will get to know that maybe one of your patients, and okay, I know there's a confidentiality thing going on here, but there are ways around it. But a neighbour down the road, he works at the airport, and you'll be surprised at the amount of people that work at airports, by the way, that don't believe in chemtrails rather. They'll tell you it's a contrail, but they're doing that in ignorance. They're not doing it to be malicious. But somebody must know somebody. And the one way around it, and I've come across this before with a police investigation, the police said, I agree with the information you've given us, but I can't tell you what I think. He didn't tell us at all. He wrote it down. So I'm trying to tap into these air traffic controllers. I only know two, and one of them's retired, unfortunately. I've got absolutely nowhere. But all we need is some registrations and finding out where these airplanes are landing. Then we can get some more intelligence on them. So the delivery of the material. So where's the strontium coming from? Where's the barium coming from, and the aluminium oxide? Well, when I went up to Doncaster, I took a lot of photographs. It was on a hot day, so the hangar doors were open. They haven't just got these 727s. They've also got a lot of airplanes that are doing surveillance. They've got all sorts of high-tech resolution cameras underneath. They've got sensors coming out of the airplane. What they're measuring, I have no idea. I can only guess. But as I say, Doncaster's closed now. But there was a 747 there, and I'm pretty sure there's only about 2 or 3 companies in the UK that are licensed to supply these chemicals. If you start ordering loads and loads of chemicals from them, that is a very obvious trail for people to follow. So a lot of this stuff comes in from abroad, quite where I don't know. But this is one of the big questions that we're asking and we're trying to find out. As I say, if I've just got a couple of registrations, I can normally find out a history. So the other thing is with regard to the payments, because you and I are paying for this, it's coming out of the tax money. Simple as. So I have a guy who I'm going to call a forensic accountant. He's actually not, but he's as good as a forensic accountant. And he did a lot of digging. And he phoned me up and he said, right, this is the way it works. The finance director forms lots of shell companies. And in fact, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. And some of them only last about 2 weeks. They get paid for whatever, and then he closes them down. So they're trying to obscure absolutely everything. And that pays for a flight, 2 flights, 3 flights, maybe. So there is a paper trail, but it's going to be difficult to follow all of it. This is not just happening in the UK. It's not just happening in the States or Canada. It's happening all over. I've got good friends who are in Belgium, and Belgium's being absolutely blitzed. And I mean blitzed. France, Germany, they've started now down in the Canaries. Cornwall, they left a bit late actually, because they obviously, I don't know, just forgot about it. Maybe it wasn't worth it. I don't think they've had it in the Scilly Isles, because I don't think it'll be that effective. Because the winds at 10,000, that's the other thing, the winds at 10,000 feet, if they're above about 25, 30 knots, it's really not worth doing the chemtrails, because it just sort of blows it all away. They don't fall to the ground. So, but it is very real, everybody. And yeah, just gonna have, so I'm going to have a quick look at my notes to make sure that I've sort of covered most things. I think I have, but just to talk about, because this is all linked to the excuse of this is climate change. We're doing it because we're getting too warm. Well, we're not getting warm anymore. We've now changed the semantics, and we're just calling it climate change, not climate warming or global warming or global cooling. The reason why the real science hasn't come out is because a lot of the real scientists have been threatened. You make too much of a noise, you know, you're going to go home, you're not going to be able to work for us, and we'll blacklist you. So this side of darkness, let's call it that way, is widespread. It's absolutely everywhere. And it's always been there. We've just never noticed it. And this real push has happened over the last 200 years, and it's accelerated over the last couple of decades to where we are now over the last 3 years. But just to give you a few little facts on CO2. So the atmosphere is made up mainly of nitrogen and oxygen, which is 98% of our atmosphere. So that leaves 2%. And the 2% are other gases, which we know as greenhouse gases. Now, out of that 2%, CO2 only equates to 4%, so nothing. Now, we know, so the out of that 2%, 95% of that, if you will, is actually water vapor. And CO2, we know, is actually quite important for the environment because trees take it in and convert bushes and so on, and they convert it into oxygen. It's their food. We also know that we're within 0.01% of not enough CO2 to sustain some trees' life, and some trees are more sensitive to this. Sycamores are more sensitive to this. I know people who've got sycamore trees in their gardens and they're dying. And the only thing they can say is, well, if it's not chemtrail doing it, it's the fact that there's a lack of CO2 in the atmosphere. Everything they've done, all the science that they have presented and the media have presented is false. It's completely inverted. The general rule of thumb is if the temperature goes up, the CO2 goes down, and vice versa. What they've told us is the CO2 goes up, the temperature then follows. That's a complete lie. One, it doesn't follow, it's inverted. So if the CO2 goes up marginally, the temperature actually historically, for as long as records have begun, actually goes down. That's the truth of the matter. And what they've done is they've relied on the misteaching they've done in schools, universities, and colleges over decades. They're relying on people not doing the homework. And by doing the homework, I mean, I'm sure most of you know now, if you go on Google, it's not all right. You've got to do other research, maybe dig out an old book from a library that's 30, 40 years old to find out the facts. So everything they've done is actually inverted, and it's all wrong. And they're also playing on people's fear. So base that on, and that is a form of control. Accelerate that over several decades, mess about with experimental spraying and so on. And you've now got to where we've got to now. The other spraying they're doing is high altitude. And this is mainly metal particulates, again, to reflect the sun. Now, believe me, when you're at 37, 41,000 feet or whatever you're flying at, it's a big place. It is a big place. So how are you going to spray lots of chemicals up in something that is a very big space? Well, the only way you're going to do it is over a period of time. The only other way you can do it is after you put something in the fuel. Now, we've rumbled this, and I have obtained fuel samples from 3 different aircraft types, and we're hoping that we can get them to a place in Italy where we know somebody with a mass spectrometer to actually see what's in the fuel. But what I can tell you is this: if there are any other contaminants in the fuel, they're going to have to be a very small proportion, and the reason is this. As I mentioned earlier, the hot section of the engine that does the burning, where all this air is compressed and the fuel is then ignited, is running at around about 730, 750 degrees Celsius. That is the most expensive part of the engine. So if there's any metal contaminants in there, what they will do is they will carbonize on the hot metal working parts. So the next time the engine goes in for scheduled maintenance and they start looking at these hot sections, if they start seeing deposits, they're going to start doing investigations. And some of these engines are, you know, a Trent engine. What's a Trent engine? I think it's about 13 million each. They're expensive. So if they are putting any contaminants in the fuel, it will be very small amounts. But then a lot of small amounts, particularly if you look at the amount of flights on a daily basis in America, for instance, it's formidable. There's you know, there could be easily 10,000 flights in the States on one day alone. So that will add up over a period of years. So that's the other thing they're doing, which is at a high level. So pretty much, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So the next play, I think, which they're going to say is you know, we've got to get the CO2 levels. Oh, Al Gore, this was important. Yes, I remembered this. So Al Gore has been putting out in his main film and documentaries he's done and stage shows that he's done. He's actually put down that the CO2 levels, parts per million, on average around the world is 400 parts per million. He said that is excessive. Actually, he must be laughing all the way when he goes back to his drinks cabinet, because that is one of the lowest recordings we've ever had in years. You go back 30, 40 years, they were 50 years even, they were recording between 1,000 and 1,200 parts per million. So in actual fact, so everything is a lie, everything is inverted. The good news is, and I'm a great believer in this, the truth will always come out, and it is coming out at an exponential rate. There are a lot of people waking up to the chemtrails. It is very real. They've been doing it over our heads. And what I find flabbergasting is when I was down in Falmouth a few weeks ago, I was looking up and a gentleman said to me, "Oh, what are you looking at?" I said, "Oh, the chemtrailing chemicals." And he said, "Oh, they would never do that." And that's the sort of level of disbelief and ignorance, even when you can see it, that we're dealing with at the moment. So I find that very frustrating, but they are very real. So I would actually appeal to all of you that if you do know a neighbour who works at the airport, or you do know, particularly an air traffic controller, I would say that most of these people, like other professionals, when they start realising that they've been duped, they normally want to find out more. And if they're willing to help, then I would only be too willing to speak to these people if they could give us information, because it is all coming out. And so that's my purpose, really, is just gathering as much information as I can to get a compendium together. We are going to get, now we know they've moved to Teesside, it's a matter of getting up there when the aeroplanes are there. We have been taking photographs of personnel that work for them. I don't think we've got any pilots yet, but they will be apprehended at some stage, because what they're doing is completely illegal. It's totally unlawful. The CAA are completely aware of it, and your MP, when you write to them, even if it's a notice, they will, I can tell you the response. It will be a cut and paste from the government website, which will say, yeah, actually you've made a mistake, that's a contrail, and then they will give you 3 or 4 pages on the physiology of how a contrail is formed, which is a complete lie. And there's 2 other things I'd just like to introduce here. There's a wonderful phrase, I like this, it's called intellectual dishonesty. Lawyers do it all the time. Half-truths. They'll dig up anything, and everything is half information, which, and the other bit of information which is not right, which is essentially misleading, sounds plausible, and that's intellectual dishonesty. The other one is normalization of deviance. This was a phrase coined by NASA, and a good demonstration of what normalization of deviance is they ship the Costa Concordia, which you may remember fell over on its side after hitting some rocks under the water. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in Italy, I think. But the standard operating procedure to go into this particular port was to go down on the left-hand side as you go in and come out on the same side, i.e. the right-hand side when you go out, because underneath the water there were 2 channels which were divided by some very sharp rocks that were sticking up. And one captain, on one occasion, did the math, did the arithmetic, and he worked out that he could actually get his boat down the narrow channel, but it was against company policy and against standard operating procedure. And there's a cliff, and it looks very impressive because people on the cliff that live at the top of the cliff looks like they can actually touch the ship. Anyway, he did it, and he did it successfully with some very accurate navigation. And then he told all his fellow captains about it. So one by one over years, they tried it, and they all ended up doing it. Unfortunately, you had Captain Gash comes along, who goes for a coffee. He leaves one of his junior officers at the bridge to navigate the ship, and he didn't navigate it correctly. He hit the rocks, and the whole thing laid on its side for about 7 or 8 years. It is the most expensive ship recovery program they've ever had, and people sadly died on that. But that is called normalization of deviance. It was deviant. They've done it that many times, they've got comfortable with it, and now it becomes the norm. It's okay. Actually, it's not okay. And you know, so with the intellectual dishonesty, that is what we've got in aviation at the moment. and also in a lot of other professions. I'll go off at a tangent here because I'll just relay this information to you, and it's something for everybody to bear in mind, particularly when you're flying on an aeroplane. And this is not fear-mongering in any way, shape, or form. We're learning very rapidly, sadly, what these jabs can do, particularly people who are fully jabbed. And I do know pilots who are fully jabbed. It's now got to, so the rules in the CAA and the FAA are very strict. In fact, the FAA have actually changed their rules. They've allowed the cardiogram. They've changed the goalposts both ways because they found pilots were starting to fail their medicals on their heart. So the FAA have changed the goalposts. The CAA haven't yet, but the CAA are very strict. I mean, very strict. So if I go to my GP and they say, yeah, you've got a bit of toe fungus, I'm going to recommend product A, there's product A and product B, I then have to get that checked out. It gives me the prescription, but I don't get the prescription yet. I have to go to the CAA and say, look, toe fungus, doctors recommended this. What do you say? And they go, no, that is not on our approved list. Product B is, go and get a prescription for product B. Now, if I took product A and the CAA found out about it, I'd have my license, the medical part of my license suspended. That then pending an investigation, pending tests, pending everything else. And in the meantime, I can't fly, which then chooses off the company. So all these pilots have run out and had this experimental jab put into their veins. So to the strict letter of the law, all of them should be suspended. There is another issue here, also that Willie Walsh from British Airways, who's the CEO of British Airways, he has been for about 15, 20 years now, I think. He, in early 2022, threw his toys out of his cot because his insurance company, AXA, said to him that if anybody dies at work as a result of the jab, because it's experimental, you're not insured. And the word anybody meant anybody. So he went public, at least on 2 occasions that I saw, and he was very vocal. The next thing we hear, he had 2 meetings with Boris Johnson, and he's never uttered a word since. So what I suspect there, and my learned colleagues agree with me, is the fact that the government have probably done a deal to say, look, if you do get an incident and it's halfway across the Atlantic, don't worry about it, we'll underwrite you. Now that breaks all the competition rules and everything else, so highly illegal. The other thing is that, and this is a sad bit, when these pilots do start losing their licenses because of their medicals, they have a very expensive medical insurance. It's normally in people's contracts. It is expensive. It's hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month. But it pays you your final salary. So it's a good thing to have. But because it's an experimental substance and the insurance company hasn't approved it, they'll still take premiums, but it won't be paid out. And this is what people are starting to realise. The other thing is, which is also coming out, is that there are simulator examiners now, because we go into the simulator every 6 months for testing, where you get all sorts of problems thrown at you, and you've got to pass everything, and obviously that gives you a valid licence for the next 6 months. They're starting to notice the pilots who are jabbed, versus the ones who are not. There are a few about. And interestingly enough, with just before Davos this year, there were 2,200 business jet flights into the adjacent airport. Not one of them, I don't think, was on flight radar because their transponder codes are hidden. And they call themselves the elites. I'm going to call them the obsoletes because that's what they're going to be. They were actually openly advertising in the business jet world, and I know people in that world, for non-jabbed pilots. So it's going to come crashing down all around their heads. As I say, there's a lot of things that are linked. But that's pretty much it. There are other things with chemtrails. They've changed the mix. Some of it spreads very quickly and then disappears. And they're the ones that sort of concern me. At the moment, they are spraying first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Yeah, what that's what they achieve, I don't know. But again, they're changing the mix, and we know historically that those three items are the main chemical base for the chemtrails. So that is pretty much my presentation. If you've got any questions, I'm only too willing to try and answer them to the best of my ability. What I am going to do with David is either try and form a Telegram group just for you guys, or if there's one that already exists, piggyback on the end of that. I do have a lot of very, very good, credible information that I can share with you with regard to, again, backing up pretty much what I've said, also the contents, and which is very, very useful. Some are longish videos, and if they are, I can identify which are the important bits in the video and send that through accordingly, but they are very, very good. They're from independent experts. They're from old newsreels. There was newsreels, I think, from the 1980s in the States, where this guy was collecting stuff in his back garden because he had a soot all over his car every morning. And a local TV station, not knowing any different, went and had it analysed, and this is where they came up with a lot of the key ingredients that the Americans were putting in their chemtrails. There is another element to this, which is another subject matter, but I'll just briefly mention it now, and it's something called HAARP, H-A-A-R-P. It's something that works on high frequency. The military are using it, the bad military are using it, and we have got a radio on the aeroplane. The long-haul airplanes have got HF radio. And simply what that does is high frequency, obviously it's the next band down from high frequency. Very high frequency. And what it does is it bounces off the ionosphere and comes down. So if I'm on my globe, I can be, and if I've done this, I've actually been on the ground in the Caribbean, and I've actually managed to talk to the operations department back in Manchester. And this signal will skip off the ionosphere, which can be anywhere from around about 50 kilometers up to about 950 kilometers up, depending on whether it's daylight or sunlight. But the fact is it can bounce around the world. And if I've got the frequency correct, then where it bounces down, although it's skipped several times, it will bounce down somewhere in the north of England, and then the company can pick it up, and then I can talk to the company on my long-range radio if I can't get them on the phone, for instance, or if I'm airborne and I have an issue and I need to speak to engineers. So it's very useful. HAARP does the same thing. However, it is incredibly more powerful than my radio. What this does is it can affect the ionosphere, which is the layer that the signals bounce off, and that's an ionized layer in the outer atmosphere, and it heats it up, and they can control the weather. If they put metallic parts in the chemtrails and put a HAARP radiation signal over here, they can actually affect, depending on the frequency and the modulation, they can actually affect all those particles. There's trillions of particles in the chemtrails to either spread or do whatever. It's very, very real. You can cause hurricanes, you can cause storms, you can cause all sorts of things. And the other thing that's believed that they can do, there are several HAARP sites around the world. We've got one in the UK. It's near, not Aberystwyth. Oh dear. So on the west coast of Wales, there's a long main town beginning with A. It's just gone right out of my head. But there's about 3 miles inland, and it's a field with a whole set of aerials. And in fact, if you can't see them because you've got to look over the hedge, but they're there. I have seen them. And that's called a phased array, and they're the most dangerous because they're the most powerful. And what you can have is a coordinated exercise, all these different HAARP sites pinging their frequencies, but if you can concentrate where these frequencies can hit on the ground, it's very possible that you can, with the frequencies that all hit the ground at the same time in the same point, and if there's tectonic plates that are unstable, you can cause earthquakes. And that is very real. And some of these HAARP devices aren't on the ground, they're actually on ships. So they've been doing, this is nothing new. It might be a shock horror revelation for us now, because we're finding out about it for the first time, but I can tell you it's nothing new. But it's something that they've been doing. They denied it for years, and now they've had to admit it. So but that's a different topic. So with the chemtrails, depending on what they put in it, they can actually also control the weather with HAARP. And they are messing around with God's creation, actually, because they do affect they heat up the ionosphere, and that causes all sorts of imbalances with the jet streams that are naturally causing around the world, and they can divert them in all sorts. Well, a good example of that, Saudi Arabia had snow last year. It's never had snow in its history. So that's a good example. So I'll leave it there. That's probably overloaded information, but I hope it's been useful.
Wow, absolutely excellent presentation from you there, Captain. Just want to firstly extend my gratitude for the detail that you went into and candidly letting us know some of the information that you've become aware of. And secondly, really just would like to commend you on your bravery, because, you know, as a GP speaking out about the COVID issue and how that has affected me subsequently, the bravery that you've shown tonight by openly speaking about the subject and what you've seen and what you know of it from within the industry takes a heck of a lot of bravery. So hats off to you, and I'm sure all of the viewers and everyone that subsequently watches this interview would agree. Absolute hero really for speaking out. So thank you very much everyone for listening, and have a great day, and just keep looking up at the sky and research this subject and see what you think. Take care.